I've been in and out of therapy since I was 18 years old, and I've definitely had my fair share of bad experiences. From the therapist who wanted to be like a daddy to me, to the one who spent the whole time talking about herself, to the therapist who thought it would be healing for me to go to a BDSM night with her. It got so bad I realised I needed therapy to recover from the trauma of my therapists. So today I thought it might be therapeutic to talk about some of the issues I have with therapy. When I criticize therapy, I'm not out to get therapists. I think they're doing some of the most important work in the world. In fact, I'm currently in therapy, and I'm someone who cares deeply about us all being able to learn, grow, work on ourselves in whatever ways that we can. I'm having this conversation because I want us to get to the point where the most liberatory, radical healing practices are possible. The first time I went to therapy, I was 18 years old. I had just left home. I didn't have any money. I was essentially homeless, and I was about to report my abuser to the police. I got free sessions through a charity, and I remember telling my therapist I was angry at the patriarchy for the sexual violence I'd endured. I was angry at the prison industrial complex that the only option for justice I had was a carceral one. And I was angry at the government for the lack of social safety nets available. And my therapist took one look at me, told me to put a raisin in my mouth and practice mindfulness. This is all part of the broader trend towards the privatisation of pain, where once I might have been encouraged to unionize, organize, or go to my community and thereby see the systemic roots of my problems. Nowadays, therapy tells us that the source of our unhappiness lies in our brain chemistry, a personal deficiency, or in childhood trauma, thereby letting the economic and political systems off the hook. In other words, logical, healthy, functional responses to a world brutalized by the structural trauma of classism, heterosexism, racism, and ableism, the intergenerational trauma of slavery, famine, war, and the subjugation of women, and climate trauma, the ever-present existential threat of collapse, is recast as a you problem. Some theorists have come to label this interior fixation as
the psychiatric reshaping of discontent,
a turning inwards that serves a very specific political function to pathologize the oppressed rather than the systems that oppress them. Even the term mental illness is itself a strategic political concept because it repositions our struggles as the fault of the individual rather than the external circumstances. Researcher China Mills writes in Globalizing Mental Health,
distress caused by socioeconomic conditions and often neoliberal economic reforms comes to be rearticulated as mental illness, treatable using techniques that draw upon similar rationales to those that led to the distress initially.
As Mills is getting at, this individualizing model can reinforce the very illnesses it seeks to treat, because this logic is victim blaming, as the onus is on us to fix ourselves. If we fail to heal, we might come to see ourselves as defective in some way.
Like, I'm just a piece of shit, why can't I be okay like everyone else?
And don't get me wrong, I do very much believe in taking radical self-responsibility. I spent years bypassing my issues by focusing all my attention on the system. And I think we all know that guy that spends all his time talking about how the system is fucked as a way to deflect any attention from his own shitty behavior. I found it so helpful to take radical self-responsibility for my life, whilst also recognizing that which is not mine to carry.
There is much more to the experience of oppressed people than their oppression. If this is the sole emphasis, we do little more than substitute one deficit orientation towards human beings for another.
That being said, even if someone comes to therapy to talk about trauma related to interpersonal violence, abuse, or neglect, these experiences are usually still influenced by systemic factors such as racism, poverty, or discrimination. In my case, although my complex PTSD was largely due to CSA, so much of my healing was predicated on feminist consciousness. It wasn't until I started to understand the violence I'd endured in the context of the patriarchy that I really began to relieve some of that victim blaming and internalized shame that I'd been carrying for most of my life. But typically, therapists avoid talking about social or political issues in sessions. Whenever I would try to bring up the patriarchy, my therapist would usually gently coax the conversation towards discussions of symptoms, coping mechanisms, relevant issues in my childhood or family, implicitly treating the patriarchy as something that we just can't change. It's just a fact of life. It didn't used to be this way. According to anthropologist Madeline Richport-Haley, belief in the influence of the social and spiritual environment on a person's health is the most common explanation for psychological problems across the world. And yet these days, drug or therapeutic intervention is the most common form of help that is offered. So I largely agree with the psychologist David Smale when he said that
therapy does not work.
Where he argued that a therapy that seeks to help people but ignores the systemic causes of suffering will fail from the start. It would simply end up treating the symptom, not the root cause, and thereby act as a tool of systemic oppression. When I was in therapy, I constantly felt my nomadism was seen as evidence of my chaoticness and the instability of my life. My neurodivergence was seen as a deficit, not a difference. And the fact that I would want a monogamous, heterosexual, nuclear family was simply assumed. In other words, I've often felt when my behaviour diverged too much from the norm, I was encouraged to have my behaviour corrected to re-assimilate to the status quo. And societal standards dictate that a wealthy, white, cis, heterosexual, able-bodied, productive man is the standard against which everyone else should be measured. And of course, most therapists don't intentionally set out to make us all conform to society, but most of them are middle class, white, normative, etc. So they're going to be able to relate and respond to people very much like themselves. This pathologization of difference and attempt to reassimilate to the socially constructed ideal is evident in the way people are diagnosed. In the latest version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health, otherwise known as the DSM, the main guide for mental health providers across most Western nations, written by a bunch of old white men, homosexuality was labelled as a disorder until 1973. Slaves that attempted to escape death camps were diagnosed with drapomania. The very names of many disorders, such as conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder, pathologize deviance, and women who are seen to defy their roles as wife and mother are labelled with histrionic personality disorder. So essentially, the misuse of diagnosis suggests that therapy can be used as an instrument of social control, as it manages behaviours that threaten to destabilize the system. Psychiatrist Thomas Saz writes that therapy functions
in a manner that pleases and pacifies the consciousness of politicians, professionals, and the majority of the people.
And don't get me wrong, it's not inherently bad to give people the tools to better function in a system that harms us. But the issue arises when that detracts attention from attempts to overthrow it or even acknowledge its ills. I sometimes wonder how the likes of Che Guevara and Martin Luther King would have fared in the hands of a therapist.
We must surely ask what it really means to be adjusted, contented, or maturely adapted when the current circumstances and the history of are characterized by all sorts of venality, dehumanization, exploitation, brutality, genocide, ecocide, and cyclical horror. We live in a world in which all human relations are infected with the afflictions of oppression. In such a world, almost all sources of comfort, emotional and material, can only be acquired at the expense of others, as well as the expense of truthfulness and the pursuit of freedom. Within the world we live in today, the goals of psychotherapy are inherently anodyne, emoliative, tranquilizing, and analgesic.
When I was in my most politically active era, not that I was ever really that politically active, But my hatred of the system, my resistance to the status quo, my political engagement was recast in therapy as self-destructive tendencies, aggressive impulses, ignorance, and even pathologized as a form of insanity. And yet I felt, and I still feel, that I'm the sane one living in an insane world.
It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society.
In fact, it's often the ones who are deemed the healthiest that are the most insane of all. Prior to his trials for war crimes, the master engineer of Nazi genocide, Adolf Eichmann, was labeled
normal
by several psychiatrists.
Not only normal, but most desirable. More normal at any rate than I am.
This is what the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton called
malignant normality.
To put it bluntly,
not all psychopaths are in prison. Some are in the boardroom.
And it's often the ones who seem the most abnormal who are actually the sane ones. Psychologist Abraham Maslow, whose life work was to investigate self-actualization, found that the healthiest people were not well adjusted in the naive sense of approval of and identification with the culture, instead had an antagonistic relationship with their much less healthy cultures. Nonconformists who challenged the systems and cultures under which they lived in ways that kept them true to their inner values, unobstructed by societally imposed ideals. An inner feeling of detachment from the culture was not necessarily conscious, but was displayed by almost all. They very frequently seemed to be able to stand off from it, as if they did not quite belong to it. What is considered sane, healthy, or normal behavior also varies widely between different societies and historical periods. Many of the heroes and geniuses of today were considered deranged in another era. As Professor of Psychology Richard Bentel concludes in Madness Explained,
perhaps the line between sanity and madness must be drawn relative to the place where we stand. Perhaps it is possible to be, at the same time, mad when viewed from one perspective and sane when viewed from another.
All of this points to the evolving, socially constructed nature of what is considered normal and abnormal in our societies. And call me crazy, but if psychologists attempt to return us to malignant normalcy, perhaps we leave the therapist office more insane than when we entered. There's something extremely unnerving about being in therapy because I'm constantly hyper-aware that I can't come across too crazy or too suicidal, because if I'm not performing, acting, coping appropriately, that can easily be used as fodder or justification for institutionalization. Therapists are legally mandated to alert the authorities if we are considered to be a danger to ourselves or a danger to others, because they can get into a lot of trouble if they fail to take all appropriate measures. This is despite the fact that psychologists' own research suggests that therapists have no reliability whatsoever in predicting dangerousness. Exact measures taken differ across nations, laws, and states. Some are definitely much more humane than others, but it's not uncommon for authorities to get you surveilled and removed from your community, put you in solitary confinement and seclusion in cells that operate under carceral control, involuntarily hold people for treatment, forcibly hospitalize and medicate people, use physical restraints and offer extremely limited access to the outside world, and force people to receive assisted outpatient treatment. Patterns of abuse and neglect are so well documented that the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture reported that
involuntary psychiatric interventions may well amount to torture.
But rather than questioning the efficacy of the system, people who fail to recover risk being labelled non-compliant or treatment-resistant. So in this sense, therapy is one of the many systems that is deeply intertwined with the prison industrial complex, meaning it's one of the many systems that functions to contain and surveil people. In fact, it's often the preferred carceral strategy because it operates under the guise and illusion of care. The medical terminology obscures its political function to disappear people whose utility to the state is questionable, which disproportionately includes BIPOC, neurodivergent, disabled, LGBTQ+, and poor people, as well as those that challenge the system. I used to work as a carer for people with mental and physical disabilities, so I am very aware that there are times where people need some kind of assisted living. So I'm not saying we should absolutely never have these types of measures in place, but we also have to be aware that shifting funding from police and prisons to therapy and treatment centres is an age-old strategy. History has shown us that when the powers that be offer the people concessions, more often than not, these reforms serve to keep us pacified and prevent revolt, replacing one system of violence with a seemingly kinder and gentler one. This was the conundrum revolutionary socialist Rosa Luxemburg faced in 1899 as she questioned to what extent reforms, which may have positive impacts, may also have the unfortunate consequence of stifling the revolution that could heal the system more profoundly. So perhaps the real question here is, as Luxemburg put it, reform or revolution. Part of the reason I never seem to get anywhere with traditional therapy is because my conscious thoughts aren't the problem. I think my problems really lie much deeper than that in my body, but I have a really hard time accessing my body because for most of my life I have been disassociated from my body. But then this year, through a random series of fortunate events, I ended up in a course to learn the art of Tantra massage. And it was honestly one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had to have my vulva touched in such a loving, gentle way after all the violations that I've experienced of my body and spirit. I just cried and cried for hours on end at the healing beauty of it. And it gave me this strong, visceral feeling that I could no longer allow these violations of my body to continue, that I kept repeating over and over again in so many new relationships. Of course, I still have a lot of healing left to do, but the release of so many pent-up emotions trapped in my body honestly did more for me than years of therapy. If anyone's interested, I talked much more about my Tantra experience and also my experience with a shamanic healer in a Patreon video that I did. I also did a separate Patreon video about all my therapy experiences where I went into much more detail about each of them. So yeah, I'll link that in the description box below. But essentially what I'm getting at is that part of the reason I think I wasn't getting anywhere with traditional therapy is because it tends to privilege the mind over the body. The emotional and felt experience is seen as something to be mastered and controlled by our bodies. Whilst there's definitely been an increase in embodiment practices in recent years, the conceptualization of the body as an object of control has been woven into the roots of mainstream therapy. For example, psychoanalysis and cognitive behavioral therapy, two of the most used forms of therapy these days, are ways to override the wisdom of the body because we're so focused on logic and reasoning our way out of what our bodies are telling us. I'm not inherently against these therapies. I personally know people who have benefited a lot from them, but in my experience, they just resulted in me being able to intellectualize about my issues until the cows come home, but never really feel any of it, just getting me more disconnected from my body. In fact, my rationalizing mind is always doing everything it can to distract and protect me from the wounding that actually needs my attention. So this type of therapy is often aiding and abetting my trauma, maybe even doing more harm than good. Of course, there is absolutely a place for understanding and rationalizing, and it's not like there's a neat dichotomy between traditional therapy and embodiment practices. But still, for me, there really is no better teacher than the simple tuning into my body, feeling my anxiety and my shame, seeing where it resides in my body, meditating on it, and trying to understand what my body is communicating to me. And sometimes our bodies hold the memory of trauma long forgotten or ancestral wounds our minds can't fully comprehend. When I took mushrooms and I began to masturbate, I felt my body transform into my mum's body and my grandma's body and my great-grandma's body. And as I was orgasming, I felt this release of all these lineages upon lineages of sexual trauma. This isn't about neglecting the mind in favor of the body. Of course, our minds can store healing knowledge that can help us. But as the physician Gabor Mate wrote in The Myth of Normal,
the intellect becomes a far more intelligent tool when it allows the heart to speak, when it opens itself to that within us that resonates with the truth, rather than trying to reason with it.
There is nothing novel about the idea that the mind and body are linked. If anything, what is new is the idea that they are separable. Traditional healing practices across the world have for thousands of years understood this link implicitly. Most of us know, if only on a gut level, that they are intimately intertwined. Therapists tend to speak exclusively of the consequences of suffering as trauma, perpetuating a victim mentality, but I don't think I've ever met anyone who's experienced some setback or illness that hasn't also felt that it was a catalyst for growth and transformation. Like, I spent most of my childhood and early 20s with complex PTSD that I'm still struggling with to this day. And whilst I wouldn't wish this upon anyone, I'm grateful for what it has taught me about compassion, resilience, and determination. This isn't to romanticize suffering or promote toxic positivity, but just as physical pain is sometimes giving us valuable information, like alerting us to the fact that we have too much stress or we're not getting enough sleep, in the same way, I think emotional and mental pain is often there to teach us too, to sound the alarm that a relationship isn't working, that we're not living in line with our values, that something isn't right. Gabor Mate said in relation to emotional and physical pain,
there is a sense in which every phenomenon of our lived experience, every seemingly new event, can be taken as a call to explore its potential and often hidden meaningfulness.
Don't get me wrong, I'm not against drugs or alleviating the symptoms of an issue. I know this can be literally life-saving for people. But my concern is that the rush to fix, cure, or alleviate suffering can numb out or obscure the hidden messages that lie behind the suffering. Not to mention, it's often counterproductive because just suppressing the monsters via drugs and avoidance only makes them larger. Allowing them out and allowing ourselves to face them is the only way to ensure they will actually go away. I also think the meaning we attribute to pain can shape how it impacts us. For example, there's a preoccupation with many people experiencing psychosis with spiritual and religious ideas, so much so that psychologists Stanislav and Christopher Groff called psychosis a spiritual emergency. An opportunity for growth and change, a radical shift in values, a breaking down of identity, and access to new realms of mystical and spiritual experiences. It's not hard to imagine how someone with the exact same constellations of symptoms might feel very differently about them, whether they were labelled as a psychosis or spiritual emergency. In fact, I can personally attest to how this kind of reframing can be transformative. Years ago, I did a meditation where I felt all these hands of all these dead children who had been abused and neglected, touching my arms and touching my legs and different parts of my body. And I had such a strong sensation that I wanted the work that I did in the world to in some way prevent the kind of violence that they and I had endured. Rather than seeing my trauma as pure suffering, it connected me to this broader meaning and broader purpose. And when it comes to my feelings of toxic shame, instead of trying to rationalize it away or shut it down, I try to sit with it, get curious about it. What are you trying to tell me? I even say thank you to my shame. Thank you for what you have done for me. I know that for many years you were just here to protect me. Either I take the messages now, or I wait for a more urgent occasion for the learning. If we all began to listen to these subtle cues more quickly, maybe we wouldn't have so many major catastrophes of mind and body, because these larger signals would no longer be so necessary. The one and only time I had a man as a therapist, I felt like he cast himself as a sort of daddy to me. He was like a disciplining father, and I was like the child or the wife that needed control and socialization. I would look at him doughy-eyed like he was my hero, and he seemed to get off on this hero complex. Unlike the women therapists that I had, he dwelt on my sexual abuse graphically. Whilst I had a gut feeling that something was off about the dynamic, I lacked the confidence to trust my intuitions were valuable, let alone that they should guide the therapeutic process. And the more he took on this paternalistic role, the more disconnected I became from my inner knowing. And whilst I know this is a very extreme case, I do believe that borrowing from the philosopher Paulo Freire's ideas in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but applied to therapy instead of education, I do believe most therapy fits the banking model of treatment. There's a power hierarchy that casts the therapist as expert and the client as the passive recipient of care. It creates a power dynamic of teacher and being taught, observer and observed, giver and receiver, actor and acted upon. The implication being that we cannot heal without control being exercised over us by some external authority. And of course, I don't think hierarchy is inherently a bad thing, but it's just interesting to me that we've removed healing from something that used to be in the hands of the people, a collective community endeavor intuitively passed down the generations by shamans, witches, wise men, and medicine women, to something that is segregated to a few select individuals who've had years of elitist education and training. Like, going back to my Tantra experience, it was so amazing to me that in the space of just 5 days, we were able to practice healing on each other's bodies that had far greater transformative effects than so much of the therapy that we'd previously done. Of course, I'm not saying I'm now capable of being a Tantra practitioner or anything like that. But what I am saying is it definitely highlighted to me the potential there is in us all being able to access and learn the skills of healing. Instead, I honestly feel that the traditional education and training of therapists kills those natural gifts and skills, the curiosity, free thinking, intuition, and creativity of therapists. So I would argue that the hierarchical way in which the therapeutic system is set up compromises clients' agency over our own healing, removes healing from the people, and generates worse therapists. So it turns out trauma these days is big business. I've often felt like therapists try to get me to feel a dependency on them, to keep me as a repeat customer. With one therapist, I kept asking for an action plan, some steps forward, some helpful strategies, and she kept saying, yeah, we'll get to that later. So I kept returning, waiting for this elusive time to come, which after 2 years never did end up happening. She also kept me in this state where I felt like she was saying, trust me, don't trust your internal guidance system, outsourcing all my trust to her, keeping me in this very dependent state. It always felt like she was passively involved, giving me praise, not really challenging my behavior, not giving me much feedback for fear of losing me as a customer. This is part of the capitalist business model of therapy. They need to retain clients in order to retain profits. Clients aren't therapized with the aim of getting to the root of our traumas, but to prompt us to return periodically for further checkups, further counseling, further prescriptions. That being said, I've also had the opposite experience where I felt pressured and harried along to produce results. I started to sort of perform progress to please the therapist. I didn't really blame the therapist for this because I knew she was under a lot of pressure from her boss to demonstrate results so that they could keep getting funding. The constant stress these therapists seem to be under to get as many clients in and out as possible led to an extremely high turnover rate of staff, which is of course understandable, but this was also re-traumatizing because clients like me who desperately need long-term relationships to heal were once again abandoned and neglected by the very people who are supposed to be there to care for us. I've also had therapists who seemed so burnt out and exhausted that I felt bad for burdening them with yet more trauma. One of my friends told me her therapist actually fell asleep whilst talking to her, and yet this really didn't surprise me because financial pressures means therapists are encouraged to see as many clients per day as possible to either make more money or fulfill funding quotas, which is of course going to be absolutely exhausting. And the fact that they have constant pressure to get as many clients in and out as possible means that they're often inhibited from doing real deep work, even when they genuinely really want to, because to do that with so many clients would either be unsustainable or simply take too much time. So it's often self-protective for them to just be passively involved. In order to avoid this burnout and subsequent poor practice, therapists might opt to see less clients but charge more money so they can make ends meet. But this then means that the people who often need therapy the most, the poor and disenfranchised, are the ones that are least able to access it. In other words, money pressures under capitalism impedes therapists from doing good work. Many therapists care so deeply about genuinely wanting to help people, but they're unable to because they're working in a broken system. Zooming out a little bit, I also think that economic incentives negatively impacts the type of therapeutic research and treatments that are provided. It's very hard for researchers to get funding unless they can justify it in terms of economic output. And this, of course, poses a lot of problems in terms of what demographics get attention, what type of research is conducted, what type of therapies are offered. A lot of what gets researched is funded by big pharma who have a vested interest in selling their pills. And in violation of the principle of conflict of interest, big pharma is directly tied to the psychiatrists who author the DSM. So the whole therapy system is increasingly becoming a multi-billion-dollar industry, an industry that prioritizes profit above care. So if I could go back to my 18-year-old self just starting therapy, it's not that I would tell her not to go, but I would probably lovingly warn her that amongst the many sites upon which battles of oppression rage, such as prisons, the education system and workplace, is the all too overlooked therapy industrial complex. Whether intentional or not, it can be used as a political weapon to control, exploit and oppress. That's not to say it can't still be incredibly helpful for many people, but I would also question to what extent healing is genuinely possible within a system that is inherently traumatizing.
The way to alleviate and mitigate distress is for us to take care of the world and the other people in it, not to treat them.
So it's not about tinkering at the knobs of a broken system, but about dismantling and remaking it.
This room should be a cell of revolution, which means it should be very aware of the political and social world that people are in, not just a revolution of consciousness, but of the actual social situations.
Luckily, we aren't starting from scratch. There are already so many revolutionary therapeutic practices to build off of. All of them are imperfect and incomplete, and I won't be able to do justice to them all here. But I think a good guiding principle when thinking about what potential avenues to explore is to what extent is this in service of long-lasting healing and liberation, or are they superficial tweaks that leave the system intact? I particularly love liberation psychology, which starts from the radical premise that all our problems are rooted in systemic oppression such as patriarchy and white supremacy, and encourages healing and transformation through critical consciousness, emancipation, and activism. Ignacio Martin Baró, the founder of liberation psychology, wrote,
"How enlightening it is to see mental health not as the result of the individual's internal functioning, but as the manifestation in a person or group of the dehumanizing or alienating character of a framework of historical relationships."
Learning from the long history of Indigenous wisdom could also be a necessary corrective to many of the problems of modern therapy by teaching us alternative modalities like witchcraft and shamanism that have been criminalized, commodified, and colonized. As I mentioned earlier, when I talked about my Patreon vlog, I went to see a shaman who helped me to find my spirit animal. Apparently, I'm an octopus, and although I can't say this was life-changing information, she did teach me that in traditional indigenous ways, they emphasize closeness to nature and honoring our emotional, social, and spiritual needs. It's not about rejecting traditional forms of therapy completely or romanticizing or co-opting indigenous ways, but we have to move beyond what the anthropologist and ethnobotanist Wade Davis calls
cultural myopia, the sense that other peoples are failed versions of ourselves or that they are ancient vestigial creatures destined to fade away. Quaint and colorful humans who wear feathers. These are living, dynamic people who have something to say.
Author Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence, also opened my eyes to the healing possibilities of plant medicines. It's not about altering the mind, but about revealing consciousness to itself. Gabor Mate said that one dose of psychedelics can often do the same amount of work as 10 years of therapy. And maybe just like Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, perhaps we can also create a psychology of the oppressed. We can bring healing and therapeutic skills back to the people, where we can all learn whatever healing modalities most interest us, so that we can create a trauma-conscious society. Embodiment practices are about recognizing the wisdom of the body, to be in relationship to the body, to listen and learn, placing the body and mind equally as collaborators rather than hierarchically.
The mind cries out, explains, demonstrates, protests. But inside me, a voice rises and shouts at it, "Be quiet, mind. Let us hear the heart."
I've been finding it really helpful to take an inventory of my body, a regular, deliberate scan. What bodily signals have I been overlooking? What wisdom is my body communicating to me? And how can I honor the messages of my body? Little by little, getting better at recognizing and responding to the little cues that my body gives me before it can become fatal.
And I said to my body softly, "I want to be your friend." It took a long breath and replied, "I've been waiting my whole life for this."
Creating robust networks of community care is also vital to help walk each other through suffering via healing circles, mutual aid, unionizing and organizing for better conditions. I want love-based relationships and communities where when someone is struggling, we can say, "We are flanking you, we have got you, we are attending to your healing," providing a love that can shelter each other's wounded spirits. Ecotherapy is about nature helping in our healing. This means opening ourselves up to greater levels of interbeing and connection with nature to heal our severed worldedness, our alienation. In the book Wild by Jay Griffiths, she references an Inuit man who said the best therapy Indigenous people could do is to go back to the land. And I totally agree, there is something so beautiful about going out into nature, being so quiet and still in my being and listening to see what pulls at my heart and follow those instructions. Whilst these are my preferred methods of healing at the moment, I'm definitely not interested in handing out a blueprint or fixed ways of being as to how to heal ourselves and the world. But my hope with this video is that it opens up some avenues of exploration and curiosity and introspection. I think in order to heal ourselves from external and internal oppression, we need to decolonize our hearts and minds. And this means a radical questioning of all systems of oppression and getting to a place where each of us has the unobstructed access to being able to manifest the most authentic version of ourselves. It's a revolution of our consciousnesses. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. I'd really appreciate if you could consider becoming a patron, liking this video, subscribing. I make Patron-only vlogs every month. As I said, this month's one was about Tantra and shamanic practices. I also made one about all the therapy experiences I've ever had, if you want to hear more detail about all of those. We also have a Discord where we do bi-weekly Discord calls and a book club. Thank you so much. Bye.